The lamp went out 3 times before they reached the chamber. The foreman thought it was bad air. The men below knew better. By the time they stood at the back of the lower drift, 640 feet, beneath the surface of Douglas Island, the timbers behind them had stopped creaking and the silence had stopped feeling natural. One of the carbide flames bent sideways without any draft to push it. Another miner, a Cornishman named Treadwell, dropped his pick and refused to take another step. He said later to a priest in Juneau that what they were looking at had not been carved by men, and that whoever had carved it had not finished the work. By 6 o'clock that evening, the entire eastern drift had been packed with mill tailings and sealed. To understand why a working drift in one of the most productive gold mines on the planet was buried in a single afternoon, you have to understand what Treadwell actually was in 1894. The image that comes to mind when people hear the word mine is wrong. There was no lonely frontier headframe with a few dozen men chipping at a vein. Treadwell was an industrial city. It had stamp mills running 880 heads at full capacity. It was the loudest place in the Western Hemisphere. The pounding of those stamp heads could be heard across the channel in Juneau day and night, and at peak operation it was crushing more ore than any other mine on Earth. Treadwell sat on Douglas Island, a narrow strip of land across the Gastineau Channel from Juneau in what was then the District of Alaska. The claim had been picked up in 1881 by John Treadwell, a carpenter from California, who had wandered north chasing the same rumors as everyone else. The story that gets passed around says that he bought the rights for a few $100s from a discouraged French-Canadian prospector named Pierre Erosard. What gets left out of that story is that within 10 years of the purchase, the operation he built was crushing more than 2,000 tons of rock a day, employing more than 2,000 men, and producing gold at a rate that funded the entire early infrastructure of southeast Alaska. The scale of the operation by 1893 had passed anything most engineers had ever seen. The Treadwell stamp mill complex covered nearly 12 acres of the island's western face. Each stamp weighed almost 1,000 pounds and dropped 100 times a minute, and there were 900 of them, give or take a few that were always being repaired. The vibration could be felt in the floorboards of houses across the channel in Juneau. Dogs in the town stopped barking at the sound by 1890. Children born after 1885 had never heard silence in their lives. The mine produced gold in such volume that Treadwell built its own assay office, its own foundry, its own sawmill, and its own electric power station. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. By the time the lower drift was being pushed in 1894, the operation was generating more electricity than the entire city of Seattle. It had its own telegraph line to San Francisco. It had its own physician, its own funeral parlor, and its own jail. It was a company nation, and the only people who saw all of its papers were a small group of senior officers in a locked room on the second floor of the administrative building. That second floor room is the one that burned in November. By the spring of 1894, the 4 connected mines on the island, Treadwell, Mexican, 700-foot and Ready Bullion, were sinking new drifts in every direction. The vein ran deep and it ran strange. Engineers from San Francisco and Cornwall described it in their notebooks as one of the most predictable bodies of ore they had ever followed, which made what happened on the night of April 19th all the more difficult to explain away. The glory hole itself was already, by 1894, one of the engineering marvels of the Pacific coast. It was an open pit 2,000 feet long and several hundred feet across, blasted from the surface of the island in a long ovoid bowl that descended toward the water table. Travelers who came to Juneau by steamer in those years often wrote home about it. They described standing on the Juno side of the channel at night and watching the pit glow from the lamps of the night shift with the stamp mills roaring behind it, and feeling as if they had come to the edge of some new industrial age that had not yet been given a name. The lower drift was being pushed beneath the eastern lip of that pit, in rock that the company surveyors had assayed and mapped in detail. The lower drift was being pushed eastward beneath the glory hole, the vast open pit that had been blasted from the surface to chase the highest concentrations of ore. The drift was deep, narrow, and damp. The crew working it that week was led by a foreman named Henrik Lund, a Norwegian who had been with the company since the second mill was built in 1887. His name appears in the company payroll books for that month. It does not appear in any report for the month after, and he does not appear in any company document ever again. The crew had been working that face for 9 days before the night of April 19th. The shift logs from the upper levels, which did survive the fire because they were stored in a different building, show that the drill bits coming back from the lower drift had begun returning with unusual wear patterns by the 7th day. The bits were dulling in ways that the company blacksmith, a man named Olaf Persson, recorded in his own ledger as the strangest he had seen in a working career of more than 30 years. The cutting edges were not chipped or rounded in the normal way. They were polished as if the rock they had been pressed against had returned the favour. What Lund's crew hit, according to 2 surviving second-hand accounts and a handwritten note in the diary of an Episcopal priest named Father Innes, was not a void and not a vein. They hit a wall. That is the word both witnesses used. A wall. The drill bit refused to bite. When they brought the steam-powered hammer up the slope and into the working face, the hammer rang back at them like a struck bell. They cleared a section of broken rock with their hands. The wall behind it was smooth. The miners who saw it described the surface as a kind of dark green stone, polished to a finish that no 19th century tool could produce. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. There were no chisel marks. There was no granular roughness of natural rock. It curved gently as if it were a section of a larger sphere, and where the wall met the floor of the drift it did so in a perfect, almost machined radius. One of the men ran his palm across it and pulled his hand away. He said it was warm. Not hot. Warm in the way a stove feels 6 hours after the fire has been allowed to die. Lund sent for the shift engineer. The shift engineer sent for the mine superintendent. The mine superintendent, a man named Robert Kinsey, whose signature is on dozens of surviving Treadwell documents, was on the property within the hour. He brought 2 lanterns and a notebook. He sent everyone else back to the upper levels. What Kinsey wrote in that notebook has never been recovered. The notebook itself was logged into the company archive in 1895 and disappeared from the same archive sometime before 1917. What we know is what Kinsey did next. He ordered 3 things in rapid sequence. He ordered the drift evacuated. He ordered every man who had been at the face to remain on the island and to speak to no one in Juneau. And he ordered tailings from the upper stamp mill to be diverted down through a temporary chute into the lower workings, packed in with crushed rock and cement, until the entire eastern section of the drift was solid. By the evening shift change, the wall was gone. The drift was gone. The eastern push, which had been one of the most promising directions in the entire mine, was abandoned and never reopened. But the miners had been at the face for the better part of 2 days before Kinsey arrived, and they had seen more than just a curved wall. According to Father Innes, who took a deathbed statement from a miner named Thomas Tregarthen in 1922, the men had used their picks to clear a roughly oval section of the green stone before being sent away. Inside the cleared section was an opening. The opening was about 4 feet wide and nearly 7 feet tall, with edges that Tregarthen described as cut, not broken. There was no rubble around it. There was no spoil pile. Whatever had created the opening had also removed everything it displaced, as if the stone had been taken away rather than knocked loose. Tregarthen had been a hard rock miner for 26 years before he came to Alaska. He had worked the tin mines at Bottolack in Cornwall, where men crawled under the seabed and could hear the ocean rolling boulders above their heads. He had worked the silver levels in Nevada and the deep gold drifts in Bendigo, Australia. He was not a man who was given to seeing things. Father Innes wrote in the margin of the 1922 statement that Tregarthen, even on his deathbed, spoke of what he had seen without embellishment, without drama, and without the kind of fear that fades a story. He spoke as if he were describing a room he had walked through that morning. Father Innes added the line, in his own hand, that he had never taken a statement that he believed more completely. Inside the opening, Tregarthen said, was a chamber. He did not see all of it. The lamps did not reach the back. What he saw in the first 10 or 12 feet was a floor of the same polished green stone, walls that rose vertically for perhaps 8 feet before angling inward toward an unseen ceiling, and 3 niches carved into the right-hand wall at regular intervals. Each niche was empty. Each niche was identical. And above each niche, cut into the stone with a precision that he insisted no man with a chisel could have managed, was a symbol. He did not describe the symbols in detail. He said only that they were not letters of any alphabet he had seen, that they were not Russian Orthodox, that they were not the Tlingit carvings he had watched native carvers make in Juneau, and that they had been cut into the stone with edges so clean that he had run his finger along one of them and felt nothing. That detail's important. He felt nothing. The cut did not have the microscopic ridges that a chisel leaves behind. It did not have the rough bottom that an acid etching leaves. It was, in his words, as if the stone had simply been told where to part. The second witness account comes from a man named Peter Bjornson, a Norwegian who had worked under Lund and who left the Treadwell payroll within 2 weeks of the incident. Bjornson made his way south to Tacoma, where he gave a long, drunken statement to a Lutheran pastor in 1908. The statement was written down. The pastor's papers were donated to a small archive in the Pacific Northwest after his death, and the relevant pages survive in a private collection that has been examined by 2 independent researchers in the last decade. Bjornson confirmed the green stone. He confirmed the opening. He confirmed the niches. He added one thing. He said that when the lanterns were held at a certain angle, the wall behind the niches was not solid, it was translucent, and inside the translucency, very faint, there was movement, not creatures, not water, movement of the stone itself, slow and rhythmic like a tide held in glass. He said that this was when the men began to refuse to work. He said that this was when Lund went up the shaft to send for Kinsey, and he said that this was what Kinsey saw in the first 30 seconds after he stepped into the working face, before he gave the order to fill the drift. Now, you can listen to that and say, it is the testimony of frightened, exhausted men in a deep mine, men who had been breathing bad air for 16 hours and who saw what fear made them see. That is a fair thing to say. It is the thing that the Alaska Treadwell Gold Mining Company said when the rumors began to spread in Juneau. It is the thing that the Federal Bureau of Mines said in 1907 when a junior inspector tried to put a question about the eastern lower drift into a routine report. The question was struck from the final document. The inspector was reassigned to a posting in Nevada. But the testimony is not the only evidence. There are several other things that need to be sitting next to it before any of this is dismissed. The first is the company's own behaviour in the months after April 1894. The eastern push, which had been the most productive direction in the mine, was never resumed. New drifts were sunk to the north and to the west. The vein was followed in every direction except the one that had already produced the richest assays of the year. When stockholders in San Francisco asked why, they were told that the eastern face had run into water that could not be controlled. There is no record of any pumping equipment being ordered for that section. There is no record of any flooding being measured. The water explanation does not appear in any internal engineering document. It appears only in the letters sent to investors. The second is the pattern of personnel changes. Henrik Lund vanishes from the company record. 2 of the men on his shift, including Tregarthen, are paid out and sent to Seattle with a year of wages in cash. Robert Kinsey is rotated to a position at a smaller property in British Columbia within 18 months and is never given a senior role in an Alaskan mine again. The shift engineer who first arrived at the wall, a man named Carlton, is granted a transfer to the Treadwell office in San Francisco and dies of pneumonia in 1896 at the age of 31. The doctor's notes on his death mention symptoms that do not match pneumonia, and the notes were sealed at the request of the company. The third is the fire. In November of 1894, less than 7 months after the incident, the Treadwell Company offices on Douglas Island suffered a fire that destroyed the eastern wing of the administrative building. The eastern wing contained the engineering archives. The fire was reported in the Juneau papers as having started in a stove. The stove in question was in the western wing. The engineer's notebooks, the shift logs from April, the survey maps of the lower drift, and Kinsey's personal record book were all in the eastern wing. None of them survived.